So the first thing that I'm going to do to navigate through here is just going to get this radiator and fan shroud out to give me a little bit more room, because I'm trying to get down there to the lower radiator hose. I'm going to try and not remove the actual radiator. So first thing that you want to do, this is a spring style hose clamp. Just pull this overflow reservoir hose off. The fan shroud does have a little clip that holds that hose in place. Now the shroud itself is held in with a couple little sheet metal type screws here. So Phillips head screwdriver. There's one on this side and one over by the battery. Set these aside so you don't lose them. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this upper hose. You'll probably get a little bit of coolant loss, but hopefully not too much. I've got a flat blade screwdriver for these worm gear clamps, and I'm going to get rid of these clamps once I get the rest of the clamps swapped out on the hoses below. But this hose does need to come out, or at least removed from the radiator and folded back so you can get the shroud itself out. So this clamp actually just completely came apart, so I'm actually surprised that that one was still holding. So not a very durable clamp. So it's generally good to have some type of bucket or catch pan to catch coolant. I like to line the floor with cardboard so it kind of soaks it up, and then I can just throw the cardboard away later. And you're just going to have to deal with some coolant spilling out. So there is a lower part of the shroud that you need to remove. Mine is actually not currently installed, but that's the last thing that you need to be able to lift this up. There's nothing that's really holding it down because there's a couple foot pegs on the bottom of the shroud. So actually, to free this corner of the shroud, you need to move the overflow reservoir. So that's a 10mm wrench. Pretty quick and easy. So just for your awareness, there is this clip on the bottom that the transmission oil cooler lines were clipped into, and so that's why I was having some trouble lifting it out. So make sure you clip that oil hose off the bottom of the fan shroud, and this should all come out. But of course, here's where the upper hose went. The lower hose, I'm going to replace the clamps on those as well. But then there's this little hard line tube, and then there's a smaller and shorter rubber hose, and that goes into the thermostat housing. So the thermostat is kind of hidden back behind this pulley bridge bracket. I think you can probably see it, but I'm going back with the OEM style clamps and just replace all the clamps down to the bottom of the radiator, where there's also that other transmission hard line there. So before I start removing these clamps, I'm going to go ahead and get this bolt right here, because this little hard line is connected with this little bracket, and that'll just allow me a little bit more flexibility to move stuff around. This is a 12mm socket. So again, with these aftermarket clamps, I'm just getting screwdrivers in here and just, wedging them in where I can. So here you can see, that lower coolant hose. I'm going to swap that out. There is this metal pipe kind of in the middle, and there is a shorter radiator hose, and that goes to the thermostat housing. And I definitely stuck an inspection mirror back there, the little telescoping poles that has a mirror on the end. And I'm trying to tell if it's leaking from the back of the rubber hose or if it's actually leaking at the thermostat housing itself. Because a couple years ago when I did my camshaft, I did replace the thermostat, and I had that thermostat housing out. So I am kind of debating whether I want to go back that far and reseal the thermostat housing, but I feel like I'm close enough that I might as well. So I'm going to start taking out these accessory belts. I'm not going to show you every single thing, but if you go back when I did the camshaft, I show a little bit of this. But this belt right here is going to be the first one. That's the air conditioning compressor. So I believe you cracked the nut. Loose on the idler, and then this is the adjuster bolt, and you lefty-loosey that, and that relieves the tension off that belt. And eventually, this bracket that those pulleys mount on has to come out. So that's what I'm going to work on. Like I said, not going to show you the whole thing, but you guys get the picture. Alright, so Here you can see this pulley bridge. Probably blocking all the light, but there's a nut there, 2 bolts on that end, and now you got better access to the thermostat housing. So I should be able to break that free and reseal it. So I could probably get to the hose right now and not take anything else apart, but I am going to reseal the thermostat housing just to make sure that that sealant is making a good seal, because I'd hate to come this far and then still have it be leaking through the RTV on the thermostat housing. So I am going to go ahead and remove this bracket, and that has the tensioning system on the power steering accessory belt right here. So underneath this tube, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a pulley, so you're going to loosen that nut, and that loosens the idler a little bit. And then right on the back side of that bracket, you see a bolt head, and you're going to lefty-loosey that, and that's going to relieve the tension off of that belt. I'm not going to show you how all that works, but you'll need some extensions and stuff to get to that bolt head. So that's the pulley and the nut that you need to loosen so you can get the power steering accessory belt off. There's another bolt on the bottom of the bracket that you need to remove, and then this entire bracket that the tube bolts to will come out, and you'll have really good access to all of the hardware on that thermostat housing. So with the belt moved, you can see where this idler pulley is. It's nice and loose, and you got a nut right there that you have to remove. You have a bolt here, and there's actually 2 bolts on the bottom. But once you get the belt off, you have to take out the metal tube and the small hose, but this entire pulley bridge or bracket will come out, and you can kind of get a feel for where the mounting hardware is. So this is not my cleanest RTV job, but I made sure that I got RTV on both sides of the bolt hole and all the way around the surface there. It's not a nice looking thin bead, but my tube was actually kind of dried, and then the actual tube split, and so I was kind of squeezing it out the middle of the actual foil pouch that it was in and trying to smooth it out the best I can. But once you put the RTV on there, you assemble it immediately, and you just loosely finger tighten the hardware until it just barely starts to squish through. And then you have to wait for an hour for it to firm up a little bit before you do a final torque. If you torque it too soon, then you can squish the rest of it out, and it'll just kind of squeeze out the edges and not make a good seal. And now you can see the RTV is kind of smeared out the side. I went ahead and just took my finger and smoothed it around the edges, but I'm going to let it sit for an hour and then do the final torque, and that should be resealed. Definitely, this is not a video on how to best use RTV. That was an ugly RTV job, but it should hold and it should do the job. So make sure you go around, all edges of the bolt hole whenever you reseal something like a thermostat housing, and make sure that you let it set up before you do the final torque so you don't squish it all out the edges. So same story on this lower radiator hose. And once I take this lower hose off, all the coolant's going to drop out the bottom, so go ahead and get your 5-gallon bucket ready to try and, ethically catch your coolant here. And there it goes. So the factory clamp is one of these spring style clamps, and it actually has a ratcheting kind of locking mechanism that locks it in the open position. So it holds it open, and then you just need to kind of grab it with pliers and twist it a little bit to uncatch it, and it'll kind of release itself from the barb, and it will close it up real tight. So I'm going to not release that clamp yet because I still got the metal tube to put in here, and actually I still got an accessory belt to put on. I might as well do that at the same time. While I'm at it, these are the screw style clamps that go on the short hose, so I'm going to just go ahead and loosely put the hose clamps in place and try and figure out the best orientation. I think on this outer one I'll put the screw up, and maybe on this back junction on the thermostat housing I'll put the screw facing straight up vertically and get a screwdriver straight down from the top. So this is that metal tube that connects the 2 hoses together, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of loosely get that into place and get the hose clamps loosely aligned. So these OEM hoses are definitely a tighter fit. and definitely a little bit more difficult to assemble than the aftermarket hoses that I had previously used. So, you know, maybe that's why they leak. Easier to assemble for a do-it-yourselfer, but maybe they don't seal as good. At least they did not in my experience. Maybe it was technique on my part, who knows. And yet another elongated worm gear hose clamp. No good. Checking belt tension is notoriously tedious to actually do it by the book. I try and look on the back side where you can actually see the adjuster bolt and look for the clean areas of the thread. The clean areas of the thread are clean because that's where it had been adjusted to previously. So, you know, it's got to have belt tension on it to, you know, transmit the power, but you don't want it too tight where you break a belt. So I try and eyeball it, like I said, based on where the clean spots in the thread are, and I try and adjust it back to that same spot. And like for the power steering tensioner over here, you know, do a full lock turn and see, you know, at slow speeds, you know, do you get belt squeal? If you get belt squeal, tighten it up a little bit more, and just tighten it up enough so that, you know, your belts don't slip and squeal. So these clamps have a Phillips head on it, but it also can be tightened down with a 10mm ratchet. So I'm going with the cordless ratchet here to tighten this clamp on the thermostat housing, making sure it stays in a good orientation where I can tighten it from the top. I'll mostly put back together. I'll double check all of these clamps. I'll probably check the factory service manual and see if they actually have like a spec. There's probably like a length of the threads sticking up from the bolt head that they spec out or something like that. Got a retaining bolt to put back on this bracket, and just got to release the spring tension on the lower radiator hose clamp, and then I'm putting the shroud back in and basically done with coolant